Hi, I'm Jeff Davis of the Sonoma County Wine Library. My guest today is one of the female pioneers in the wine industry. And it's a shame that so many people who are worthy enough of having their histories recorded for future generations often are not household names. But Zelma Long has worked with Robert Mondavi, Simi, and Domaine Chandon, and has numerous accolades and honors throughout her long career. Zelma Long, thank you for joining me today.
A pleasure.
We're here in your backyard above Chalk Hill Road. Might hear a truck go by or two, but that's part of the industry, isn't it?
Yes.
You have crafted and consumed fine wine throughout your career, but you also have a great thirst for education, don't you?
I do. I love to learn. And I think that's one of the reasons I've been good at what I've done, because I've learned a lot while I was working, especially about viticulture, but also about winemaking.
Before we go further, where were you born and where did you grow up?
I was born in Eastern Oregon in a town called the Dalles on the Columbia River. And I grew up there, graduated from high school. Then I went to Oregon State University in Corvallis.
Yes, I saw that. I was going to ask you about that. And that's why you went to OSU, because you lived up in that area.
Exactly.
And after that, though, you did come down to the Bay Area. You had a chance to do an internship at University of California, San Francisco Hospital. Is that correct?
You know what I did? I came down between my sophomore and junior year to work at UC Berkeley in their Department of Nutrition. I was just an intern. And I met Bob Long, who I was to marry after I graduated from college. And then after I graduated from college, I had a science degree. And my mother had suggested maybe nutrition would be a good thing for a young woman to do. So I had majored in nutrition, minored in science, or vice versa. And I started working at UC San Francisco Medical Center.
Okay.
And at first I did an internship for a year. Then I looked around for a job.
And so you had a short career as a dietitian, from what I understand.
Well, I worked 2 years in the Oakland Alameda Hospital, and we lived in Oakland near Lake Merritt. But then we took a year off and went to Europe. And
Nice.
that was a transition, let's say, because when I came back, at that time, nutrition wasn't that important to doctors or people. It wasn't like it is now, where now everything you put in your mouth is important. It wasn't that way at all. And my father-in-law was starting a vineyard up in Napa Valley in the Eastern Hills. And so I thought, well, I have a science background. I'll go back to school and study winemaking.
That totally changed your career. At
Yes,
least
it
started it on a different path.
It certainly did, thankfully.
Yes. And that was about, what, 1966?
I graduated from college in 65, so it was 68 and 69. I was going to Berkeley going to Davis working on my master's
Okay, so
in enology and viticulture. And then in the summer of 70, Mike Grgich called me. Or he called the house, and he called my mother, and she could hardly understand his name, but she gave me his phone number. So I called him back, and he said, you know, I'm looking for someone to work harvest with me at Robert Mondavi. And I said, well, I can't. My mother is visiting. I'm going back to school, but thanks for calling. The next day, he called back, and he said, this will be a great learning experience for you. You know, you'll work through harvest, you'll see the wines, and you really should consider it. So I said, sure, just for the fall quarter.
Sure, that's what they all say. So you decided to go pursue an enology and viticulture degree. You go to UC Davis, you're going to get a master's.
Right.
You're there for, you said, what, 2 years?
2 years.
And how did Mike Grgich get your name? Like, what inspired him to call you?
He called the professors at UC Davis, and they gave him my name.
Wow. So you were already blazing a trail by that point.
I guess.
So you worked at Mondavi for a number of years, didn't you?
Yes, quite a number. I started harvest of 1970, and I left harvest of 1979. So the first year or two I worked as Mike's assistant, and then the winery was growing. It almost doubled its crush capacity for the first few years, and I figured he needed an assistant. So I wrote a job description for the assistant, and then I applied for the job.
Nice.
Got the job. And then Mike left. He went to go to Chateau Montelena, and he made that famous Chardonnay that won the French competition. Mm-hmm. And so I was promoted to chief enologist at that time. I think that was 73.
So you're one of those who understands the benefits of pursuing an opportunity, making it happen, and you certainly did in that case.
That's correct.
And what's this I read that when you left Robert Mondavi to go to Simi Winery, he said that was one of his biggest losses he ever experienced?
Oh, I didn't know he said that. That's really sweet.
Oh, you didn't?
No.
Oh, It's on your Wikipedia page.
Well, so sometimes things get out there, like many places I've seen it listed that I got my master's in enology at UC Davis, which I did not.
You never did complete.
You know, so you never know where all this information comes from. But it was really fun to work with Bob Mondavi. He was very single-minded. We're going to make wine that's as best of the wines of the world. And he was funny. He would come around with us during harvest. Mike and I would go around and taste all the fermenters. And one year he was like, well, you really shouldn't ferment those white wines over 55 degrees. And then the next year it was, well, you really should ferment them at 60. So we're like, sure. But Mike was the guy. I mean, Mike was a really great winemaker, as has been proven later.
Yeah, so it helped you on your path for sure to become a better winemaker, and what a great experience to have the time there at Robert Mondavi after he left.
Yeah, it was wonderful. And of course, the other thing that was wonderful is Bob Mondavi was very experimental. So he bought grapes from the Central Coast. He bought some grapes from Washington. He bought various pieces of equipment. So there were a lot of opportunities to work with things just outside of the normal, what you would expect from your local vineyards.
And it seems like you took that with you when you went to Simi Winery in 1979, because you really revamped that property, didn't you?
Yes, I did. Yeah. And I was, when I was hired, they had already made the decision. It was owned at that time by Shefflin and Somerset in New York, who was a marketing company for Moet Hennessy. Mm-hmm. And they had made the decision to revamp Simi and invest in it. So there was an opportunity to build a fermenting cellar, which just doesn't come along every day for a winemaker.
Yeah.
And there was also opportunity for me to acquire the grapes for the winemaking, which I was very interested in the vineyards.
So again, we're in the late 70s, early 80s. I should take a sidetrack here and ask you, did you have any challenge being a woman in the industry at that time? Because you were certainly one of the few. Or were you so well respected that it wasn't even an issue?
It wasn't much of an issue. I'd say what was a little frustrating to me at Mondavi was that there was that glass ceiling of the family. You know, so Tim came in about halfway through my time there, and he was slowly taking over the winemaking. And he's a great guy. It was lovely to work with him, but it also set a ceiling. So when the Simi people came through and said, you know, we want to build a cellar, you would have this, and so on, it was a good decision.
Sure, yeah. And a nice opportunity to work in another county.
Absolutely.
And also interesting that you left one of the newest wineries from Napa Valley to one of the oldest wineries in Sonoma County.
I know, isn't that amazing?
Simi was established in 1876, I think.
Yeah, something like that. I've forgotten, but it was a long time ago.
And when you got there, it probably looked like it had been around for quite a while.
It had, that old stone building had wooden floors, which I imagine it still has. And it had big redwood fermenting tanks. And it was definitely old style.
And I saw you were the VP of winemaking at Simi. Were you hired at that title, or did you obtain that after you'd been there for a little while?
When I was interviewed, I told them I wanted to be the VP of winemaking.
You've had some great success telling people what you want to have for yourself. Tell us about some of the revamping you did there at Simi Winery.
Well, I built a new fermenting cellar. As I recall, it was 16,000 square feet. And we had a contractor, Michael Dixon, who was the president, did not hire an architect. He hired a contractor who laid out, it was basically a rectangular building, but I had to furnish it, so to speak.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
So the refrigeration systems, the systems to remove the pomace, the press, the fermenters, and the lab and the storage. I mean, I had to design everything and purchase the equipment.
Nice.
And I had a woman, Barbara Lindblom, who had worked with me at Mondavi, and she had done lab work there. And so I basically hired her. We had a certain square footage for the lab. I hired her to lay out the lab. And then she became the first lab director.
I should point out that Marianne Graff was there at Simi, wasn't she, before you?
Yes, it had been a series of women winemakers because Isabel Simi Haig ran that winery for decades.
Yeah.
And then Marianne started, I think, around 1970. And she made that great 74 vintage, and she left that year that I started. She left in 79 and started Vinery.
And during your time at Simi, once again, you decided to further your education. You went and got an executive degree?
Well, that was 88, and I was slated to take over from Michael Dixon in 89. And so I suggested that I go to Stanford Executive School. And because at that time, Simi was owned by LVMH, Louis Vuitton, Moet Hennessy,
yeah, Moet Hennessy,
who had acquired Simi in 81. And even at that time, it was Louis Vuitton, Moet Hennessy. And so they acquired Simi. And there's some funny stories about that, which I don't think I'll relate.
Oh, come on, please share.
Well, you remember, Bernard Arnault, who's a very powerful man. He has basically made LVMH into what it is. Mm. It's the world's largest luxury company. Mm-hmm. And he came to visit Simi, and we sat down at lunch, and he sat across the table from me, and he asked me what the difference was between Cabernet and Chardonnay.
Really?
And
wow.
So I very professionally, respectfully described the difference. But it told me that he wasn't sensitive to grapes and vines. Yeah. I mean, he was an amazing businessman.
Well, and that ownership at Louis Vuitton Moet Hennessy kind of led you into your next position, which was at Domaine Chandon.
That was a position right at the end of my time at Simi. And what that ownership did during the 80s was it actually allowed me to do a lot of things overseas. Uh-huh. I worked, I went to Italy and worked in Chianti for Shefflin and Somerset. I went to several technical seminars with the LVMH group because they had a winery in Argentina that was making sparkling wine, and they wanted to start making still wine. So I went down there to consult with them on Chardonnay.
Nice.
And we had a technical meeting in Epernay. And then one time for marketing, I went on a trip through Japan from north to south with the sparkling winemakers from Argentina and from Australia, Domaine Chandon, Australia. And I was supposed to be the spokesperson for Domaine Chandon here, which of course I did. But in between the stops, I would be interviewing the other winemakers about how they did their sparkling wine, because I never made sparkling wine. Yeah, but Simi was one of the few still wine wineries that LVMH owned.
So your new title was VP of Business Development.
Right.
So yeah, you just kept climbing, didn't you?
Well, that was at the same time I was doing that, my husband and I, Philip Freese, started a wine project in South Africa. That was around 1997. I left Simi. I essentially retired at the end of 20 years there, which is the earliest retirement I could do. And we had started the project in South Africa by buying land in 97. And everybody thought we were totally nuts, to be buying land in South Africa and making wine there. That was only 4 years after the changeover, after the end of apartheid.
Apartheid, yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. I guess the wine industry was in its infancy at that point there.
Strangely enough, it wasn't. The South African wine industry is very, very old.
Oh.
And there are wineries there that were established in the 1800s.
Okay.
But it was not technologically advanced because the South African wine people weren't welcome in the rest of the world.
So you were able to bring your talents and your skills and modern technology and that experience down to South Africa.
Yes, in fact, Phil and I, because Phil was an experienced and highly respected wine grower.
Right, I heard that.
So
yes.
from his perspective, a grape grower, you grow grapes and your end product are the grapes as they go out of the vineyard. From a wine growing perspective, the end product is the wine. And so all the work you do in the vineyard is focused on creating the kind of wine you want that's appropriate for that site. So we were invited down to South Africa in 1990 by the Cape Estate wine producers.
Oh.
And we, together we gave an all-day presentation to the industry about winemaking and wine growing. They were particularly interested in the use of barrels in winemaking. And after that, they sent us to 3 different parts of the wine country, which is in the Cape, west of Cape Town. And at each place we stayed overnight with a vendor, and then there was a tasting the next morning where people from different vineyards would bring their wines, and we would taste them with them and give our comments or discuss whatever they wanted.
What a
to
great
discuss.
introduction and opportunity for you to get to know the area.
It was fascinating, and it allowed us to see a lot of parts of the wine country, to experience the physical environment, which was maritime, and to see the soils, which were very different from anything we have here, like decomposed granite and ancient soils in our vineyards, clay with rocks. It goes back to 1,000 or not 1,000, 1,000,000 or 1.5 million years.
Yeah.
It's really old soils. So it was really interesting to us, technically. And we thought, you can make great wines here in South Africa. It has all of the components to do that. So that's really, I went back several times. I was invited back to taste for South African Airways and judge their wine, the wines for them. And so by the time we purchased our land, we both had a pretty good grasp on what the industry was doing, what their strong points were, what the weak points were. We actually wanted to contribute to the industry.
Yeah, great.
And so.
And what did you choose to plant initially?
We tasted a lot of good Cabernets and felt they could be better. Mm-hmm. And we were both very experienced with Cabernet and Bordeaux varietals. Mm-hmm. So we plant, and there's other reasons for planting Bordeaux varietals in the sense they're widely planted, widely respected. Cabernet is probably the king of red grapes. At least it was at that time. So it was also a good commercial decision.
Sure.
So we planted Cabernet, Merlot, Malbec, and, what was the word? Malbec. Not Petit, Cabernet Franc. Oh. Cabernet Franc, Malbec, and Merlot.
Okay, yeah. And it did well? And still doing well?
Oh, yes. Yeah, we're one of the top wines in South Africa. And in 2016, our Bordeaux blend Series C, we make 2 Bordeaux blends, won the Seven Nations Wine Challenge Bordeaux Trophy. So
nice.
I knew you could make internationally great wine there.
Tell us the name of the winery down there in South Africa.
Vilafonte.
Vilafonte.
And it's the name of the soil series in our vineyard.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And we have tried to research where that name comes from, but we've been unsuccessful.
Yeah, interesting. And you've had other opportunities, and about that same time you started your consultancy.
I started consultancy pretty much after I left Simi, but it kind of happened. I wasn't.
Yeah, you were already going around the world and offering advice and helping others.
I wasn't focused on doing consulting, but I was approached by a couple of people to do it.
You got to work in Bordeaux. You mentioned that a minute ago, and also Germany and France, other places in France, I guess, and Argentina, as you mentioned, Italy, and then you also started working with the Washington wine growing.
Right. It was really wonderful because I grew up in Oregon. I worked with both Oregon and Washington wineries. And I spent quite a long time, about 14 years, working at Golan Heights in Israel.
I hear they have great opportunities to make good wine there.
They do. Golan Heights it's at the base of mountains. So in the winter, there's often snow, both in the mountains and on the ground. And so there's a good source of water, which is really important. And I developed such a deep respect for the Israeli, the winery was a big winery, crushing, I don't remember exactly, but maybe 5,000 tons. And so they made a wide variety of wines. I've seen a lot of big wineries around the world, but I've never seen one that operated at such a high level of skill. It's that winery. It was really fun to work there. And quite a bit of what I was doing was suggestions about the vineyards, because I could see right away that there were better ways to work with the vineyards. And so I would make some suggestions about what to do. And then I'd come back the next year and they would have done my suggestions. And then with the strategy, they'd taken it on a couple levels up.
Oh.
You know, they didn't just take information, they took it and ran with it. So it was very satisfying work.
Yeah, you
and
were
it
inspired.
It gave me an appreciation of how small Israel is.
Oh.
And how smart those people are.
Interesting.
It was very interesting. I'm so glad I was able to do that work.
Is that one of your favorite places of all the locations you've had a chance to work in?
Well, I worked there a long time. Some of these times when I went to Italy and Argentina were fairly, maybe a couple years, or one time the German winemaking we did was on our own behalf. And that was fascinating just because of the weather, understanding the weather in Germany. But the thing about Israel, it's so ancient. You know, I took a tour one time. They take you to sites where there were these copper smelting in these very old systems of rocks and fire, and that copper used to be acquired from Egypt and from the north of Israel. I mean, it was a central place for smelting copper in that whole region. And then you understand that Jerusalem is like 3,700 years old. Yeah. And you compare it with our country, our towns. It's phenomenal.
I was going to say, if you have a process that works for thousands and thousands of years, why change it?
Yeah. Well, there was a lot of change in that period of time.
At least with the smelting of copper. Maybe.
Yes. Okay.
No need to change that.
And there were places in the hills where you'd see these big rock formations, and they'd hollowed out a round circle where they would press the grapes, and then there was a dip in that circle where the juice would drain out into another area that had been cut out of the stone to hold the juice. I mean,
wow,
it's
gravity flow that
seriously
goes back
old.
quite a while.
Yeah.
Quite a while. Huh. How fascinating. How fun for you to see all of that and participate in it.
Exactly.
Yeah. You've also contributed to numerous publications, including Mike Grgich's book.
Yes.
You did the foreword for The Glass Full of Miracles.
I know. I love doing that too, because I read the book first, and I was I knew Mike came from Croatia. I kind of knew his background, but when you read the depth of what he did, what he went through to get to Napa Valley, all the places he worked, how he had to smuggle money out of Croatia, and then, of course, what he did in Napa Valley, he's really a phenomenal man.
Yeah.
I was, so when I wrote the introduction, I said, well, you'd think I'd be writing it about Mike in Napa Valley, but really, he had a whole life before he came to Napa Valley.
And then was able to bring his nephew over too, who's Ivo is very ingrained at the Grgich Hills and has been for quite a while now.
Which is wonderful.
Yeah. You also have 2 oral histories at the Bancroft Library in Berkeley, and of course you've received numerous awards and accolades and honors over the years.
True.
Just for a few, such as Italy's Masi International Award, you received the California State Fair Lifetime Achievement Award, the James Beard Hall of Fame, and you've been accepted to the Culinary Institute's Hall of Fame. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And certainly well-deserved. You're probably mentioned in a number of other international organizations.
Well, I was fortunate. And, starting at Robert Mondavi gave me a presence in the industry because he was already a leader. I grabbed the opportunities that were afforded me. I loved working with other winemakers and learning about equipment and grapes and wine growing and trellising. I started with Diane Kenworthy, who became the president of the American Society of Enology and Viticulture. She worked as my viticulturalist. And we started a group, it was the North Coast Viticultural Research Group, where a bunch of viticulturalists and winemakers from Napa and Sonoma got together. And we funded research at UC Davis that connected winemaking and wine growing, connected viticulture and enology, which at Davis they've been taught as separate disciplines, but the interaction of them hadn't been explored so much. And so we each contributed, I think it was $4,000 a year. And there was 8 individuals, 8 wineries. So that was a group, a section of money that we could give to UC Davis and say, here are some of the things we would like researched. And irrigation was one of them, rootstock, road direction, trellising issues. And then we would each experiment with those, like put in 4 rows, 2 of one trellis and 2 of the other, or Phelps did 3 different irrigation systems. And then we'd share the outcome, and we'd share it with the university people that came to work with us.
And then the university shares it with the wine regions around Northern California.
Plus, Phil, for example, was the wine grower and wine purchaser for Robert Mondavi, purchasing 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 tons between the vineyards and the purchase. And then Bob Steinhauer purchased for Behringer. So these guys didn't just buy the grapes, they went out in the vineyard and they talked about how to grow them. So a lot of the stuff we were learning got infiltrated out into the industry by those of us that had learned them.
Yeah. And interesting, even decades later, they're still doing research projects and still learning more and more about wine growing and wine making.
I know.
It's fascinating.
I think it's the way science goes, businesses go. You learn something, and then once you're there, you find something else, maybe 3 specific issues that you study and improve, and then each of those 3 specific issues has 2 issues.
Right, yeah.
That,
and here we are in 2021, still learning.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I just looked at a wine enthusiast article that said, it talked about the California or the Napa wine industry from 78 to 88. It described it as the golden era of winemaking. This was in 1988. And it said in that period of time, 50 wineries emerged in the Napa Valley. Wow. I'm thinking, well, there's 500 now. But I mean, that's what I was privileged to see, was that growth. And then I was able to apply that to other areas like Argentina, to go into areas in South Africa and understand what that development curve could be. And we've seen a great development curve in South Africa.
Oh, I imagine, yeah. The funny thing is, you've had this long, illustrious career, and then what do you do at this point? You went back to school again. You got a PhD last year.
Yes, I did.
And unrelated to the wine industry.
Well, I've always loved and been interested in art, not as an artist, but as an art appreciation person. And whenever I really love something, I get serious about it. And I thought, well, if I go back to school and study art, that would be so fantastic. And of course, the fact that I had never studied art before. I had no master's or bachelor's in art. Didn't deter me.
It was a little more challenging, though, than you expected?
You know, what was actually challenging was not the course of study. The other thing is because most of my work has been scientifically based, I was interested in rounding out my knowledge in the humanities. And there it was in the humanities. And my professor that I had met was a professor in performance. And one of the parts of performance studies embodied knowledge, like knowledge you have, because if you picked it up, you've learned it. You didn't go to school. It's in it. It resides in your body. It's just like automatic. when something comes up. And I thought, well, that's interesting, and I'd really like to study how artists do their work, how they perform their work. And so that's what led me into performance. And then I was interested in Native American studies, because when I was a kid, my birthstone's turquoise. I was able to go to the Southwest a time or two. And I'm also interested in other cultures. We travel all over the world to see other cultures, but in fact, we have hundreds of Native American cultures here in the United States.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
And so that was a revelation in a wonderful course of study, which was my minor.
Wow, good for you. I'm impressed with your ability of not being able to just sit around. You just keep moving. And it's probably contributing to your youth.
Yeah.
You still have a very youthful exuberance about you.
Yeah, I'm sure it is.
Wow.
And and still, I just feel, to some extent, all this stuff is rolled out. It just sort of naturally flowed, and I saw opportunities and followed them. But some people have a hard time for a variety of reasons, having that happen. And so I feel...
Well, I think a lot of that comes down to the ability to recognize opportunities, and you guide yourself, and that just carries you along.
That's absolutely correct. Yeah.
So before we wrap up here, tell me about the wines that you are now bottling at Vilafonte, and if our viewers would care to order some, how they can do so.
Well, I mentioned that we planted these 4 Bordeaux varietals, and we have a partner in South Africa, a younger guy, who grew up in a high-end winemaking family there. So it's this great partnership. I'm the winemaking partner, Phil is the wine growing partner, and Mike is the managing partner, because he's on site. But he's a sales and marketing genius as far as we're concerned. So it's a very strong partnership. Even though we're small, we only make about 5,000 cases of wine. But we talked among us, we obviously were going to make a Bordeaux blend. And we started with the concept in Bordeaux, first wine, second wine. And I started making wine. We planted in 1-hectare blocks. I started making wine from each block in 2000 because I wanted to see the character and personality of each of the blocks. And after I did that for 2 years, 3 years actually, I thought, each of these blocks has the potential to be a first wine, and I don't want to have the mindset of a second wine. And furthermore, they're different. Like there's Merlot that's really structured and Merlot that's fleshy. There's Cabernet that's structured and Cabernet that's fleshy. So somehow to put them all together seems like we would lose the potential personality of these different blocks. So I suggested we do 2 wines, one that was Cabernet based and one that was Merlot based with a little bit of the Malbec. And that, then there, of course, there's a discussion about what do you call them. And so we did it simply. We did Series C and Series M. I have a BMW, so I like the series name. And Series C stands for Cabernet Style. It wasn't a percentage guarantee, it was style. And Series M stands for Merlot Style. But the Malbec was so successful in our blends, very fleshy, and black fruit with the red fruit of the Merlot, that the Series M came to stand for Merlot and Malbec, with a little bit of Cabernet for structure. And we don't have an outline of what percent goes in each wine each year. We start out with all the wines in front of us and taste them all and then assign them to the different blocks.
Yeah, might as well.
And then, of course, like most wineries, we had some wine like press wine, wine from younger vines that shouldn't go into your lead wines. And so in 2012, I said to our marketing partner, we need to take these wines and put them together and create a nice wine at a lower price point. Mm. So he named that wine Seriously Old Dirt. And he named it because when Phil first saw the vineyard, he said, wow, this is seriously old dirt.
Nice.
Because that vineyard has artifacts from Homo ergaster, who was pre-Homo sapien.
Oh, geez. Stone
artifacts that you could see and pick up.
Oh.
So that's what happened.
Wow.
And the Series C and Series M were so useful because if you call a wine Joe and Sally, the retailer may not remember.
Sure. Yeah.
The difference.
Mm-hmm.
And so by saying Series C and M, and they can connect it with a Cabernet and Merlot, it just made it easy. And we're selling those wines through Cape Ardor.
That's the website.
And
Cape
it's
Ardor.
Ardor. And they have a lot of very good South African wines and wines from New Zealand and other places. Mm-hmm. So it's a good place.
And they can get your wine there.
They can get our wine there, yeah. Absolutely.
Now, interestingly, when I asked you a few weeks ago, we were talking about Pinotage, mm-hmm. and I asked you, I was telling you I was having trouble finding some around here in Northern California, and you suggested Cape Ardor. And so I did order a couple of Pinotages from there, but you didn't tell me about, I should order some Vilafonte.
You should order some Vilafonte.
Oh, okay.
Series M, Series C, and
I will do that.
Seriously Old Dirt.
Well, Zelma, you are not only a pioneer, but you are also an inspiration to all winemakers, male and female, no doubt. And it's been a real pleasure to get to know you, and I'm happy to share your story today. So thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you. It's always a pleasure to tell the stories.